Disclosure: in previous years I was invited by the Panzermuseum Munster. Recently I received an email by someone that stated the following about WW2 research. I believe scholars have neglected the battlefield role mounted troops had. He also notes that tanks like the Panther often get more focus. Additionally, he specifically referred to the cavalry units of the Red Army. And looking at what Glantz wrote, it seems he might have a point. As anachronistic as they seemed, the Red Army relied heavily on horse cavalry forces, particularly in an offensive role. During the initial period of the war, when its tank forces were in disarray, and thereafter when they proved capable of operating effectively in difficult terrain. Hence, cavalry forces contributed significantly to the Red Army's victory at Moscow in winter of 1941-42, at Stalingrad in November and December 1942, in Ukraine during the winter of 1943-44, in Belorussia during the summer of 1944, and in Manchuria during August 1945. Additionally, he also gives some numbers. The People Commissariat of Defense created 82 new cavalry divisions between July and December 1941, 6 of which were of the light variety. And by year's end had combined many of these divisions into new cavalry corps. This brought the total number of cavalry corps in the Red Army to 7 on 1st January 1942 and the quantity of cavalry divisions to 82. These cavalry corps and divisions proved invaluable during the fighting in late summer 1941 and later during the Battle of Moscow and the Red Army's winter offensive of 1941-42, when in lieu of heavier mobile forces they spearheaded offensive operations and conducted deep exploitation operations into the Wehrmacht's rear area. Be aware that Soviet cavalry divisions also had their organic tank units as well, particularly the light BT tanks. This seems to confirm the neglected aspect of the cavalry in World War II research, although only at first glance, because Glantz is a very important scholar of the Second World War and he has apparently not neglected the impact of the cavalry. Yet there's one more catch here. If you look at the Germans, the Americans and the British, they had very few cavalry units. I mean, with horse cavalry. The Americans had cavalry divisions, yet with very few exceptions they were not equipped with horse cavalry. The last US cavalry division charge with horses was conducted in January 1942. Ironically, the last horse-mounted charge by a US division in World War II was conducted by a mountain division in Austria in 1945. The Germans had a few cavalry divisions, and they also created one cavalry corps in 1944 that fought until the end of the war. Yet still, that is a rather minor affair. Also, these units were first and foremost used on the Eastern Front and the Balkans, not on the Western Front. So when it comes to cavalry in the Second World War, it's not about the Western Front. Considering our rather Western-centric view, one could argue it was neglected due to that aspect. But is it really neglected if there's little relevance for a Western audience? Yet there are other issues as well. Cavalry was very manpower heavy and loss intensive when used in modern combat situations. The British and Americans in particular tried to keep their losses as low as possible, for various reasons, including political considerations and the fact that the manpower pool was in fact low. Meanwhile, the Soviets had a large manpower pool and were less sensitive to losses. Because the Red Army's cavalry forces were so vulnerable to Wehrmacht artillery, tanks and aircraft, and both horsemen and horses were increasingly in short supply, the People's Commissariat of Defense of the Soviet Union decreased its cavalry force structure to 12 cavalry corps, 46 cavalry divisions and 7 cavalry regiments on 1st July 1942, 10 cavalry corps, 30 cavalry divisions and 3 cavalry regiments on 1st February 1943, and 8 cavalry corps and 26 cavalry divisions on 31st December. Despite these reductions, cavalry forces would remain integral and valuable elements of the Red Army's mobile combined arms team throughout the remainder of the war. This brings us to the next point, namely the limits of cavalry, and I think there are similar issues here with armored trains. So what are the similarities between cavalry and armored trains? Well, I think the issue with cavalry in World War II is rather simple. It is useful in a certain context. That context is almost the same as that for armored trains. And if you didn't watch my video on why armored trains, well, here's the short version. Armored trains work rather well in an area where there's bad infrastructure, a low force density, and more or less bad terrain. For armored trains, of course, there's also the requirement for rails. To quote Zaloga on the employment of cavalry divisions, the 1944 Cavalry Division lacked the anti-tank battalion normally found in Soviet units of comparable size, and this can probably be ascribed to the doctrine of using cavalry formations in areas such as the Pripyat marches that were inaccessible to tanks. The supply trains elements were somewhat expanded. But in spite of this additional cargo capacity, the division was capable of independent action for only 1 to 2 days in moderate combat. For 1945 he notes, unfortunately, Horst cavalry was still vulnerable to tanks, aircraft and massed artillery to a degree not suffered by other branches. By the start of 1945, the Soviet army had advanced past all marginal terrain of Eastern Europe, and the cavalry corps were relegated to second-line security duties. Even the campaign in Manchuria, with its rough, desolate terrain, found little use for the Horst cavalry elements. A cavalry/mechanized group was formed under the Trans-Baikal Front, but this included only one Soviet cavalry division, the 59th, and appears to have been formed mainly to take advantage of the existing Mongolian 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th cavalry divisions rather than out of any specific military requirements for Horst units. The other cavalry division in the Far East, the 84th, played no major role in the operation. Note that this differs from what Glantz wrote about the campaign in Manchuria. Anyway, armored trains and cavalry in the Second World War were very useful in certain areas, but you saw very few armored trains or cavalry in the western theaters of operations, like in Normandy, because both were easy targets in an area where there was a good infrastructure and a high force density. If an armored train faces a tank company of up-to-date tanks, it will be blown up rather fast. If you have an armored train somewhere where there's basically no tanks, its armor and firepower will overwhelm most forces. Similarly, in the marshes, horses are more mobile than most regular World War II vehicles. And this is also why there are basically no cavalry units on the Western Front. Of course, for small units like recon, squads, platoons or companies maybe, it might still be viable. But if you can get the alternative of an armored car, probably most soldiers would choose the armored car or even a motorcycle. At least on the Western Front. On the Eastern Front it might be different, depending on the infrastructure and logistical situation. Same comes with partisan warfare or its counterpart, counterinsurgency warfare. There are also horses or cavalry might be very well suited, and they were used. The dissolution of the German Army's 1st Cavalry Division in autumn of 1941 seemed to mark the end of that army's former cavalry tradition. True, the mounted squadrons of Divisional Reconnaissance Battalion remained, but the presence of horse-mounted maneuver units capable of independent action under the control of higher echelon command appeared over for good. As things turned out, for good lasted for about 12 months. In fact, throughout the period from November 1941 to December 1942, various mounted units continued in existence in addition to and sometimes amalgamated from divisional reconnaissance squadrons. In July 1942, for example, an improvised cavalry brigade was authorized by the then commander of the 9th Army, General Walter Model. It had the mission of helping eliminate Red Army forces, some 60,000 strong, still occupying a salient in the dense, swampy forest behind 9th Army's lines. To give a more recent example here, as Andrew pointed out, in 2001, a small group of US Special Forces used horses in Afghanistan that fought with the Northern Alliance that had larger cavalry units as well. Now, the author of the email makes many good points, yet most of them are for very limited scenarios. For instance, it seemed like mounted men on horses were the best way to infiltrate enemy lines in open countryside, considering the tanks would not really be able to sneak around as effectively as horses and not observe the enemy's formation from within. Additionally, it makes very correct observation that World War II vehicles were far less reliable and cross-country capable than modern vehicles. Yet if we look at the overall relevancy, the main issue is that tanks are far more versatile than horses for combat operations. Furthermore, Soviet cavalry divisions also had their own organic tank units. Basically, you can use a tank division in a lot of terrain. And of course, there were terrains you can't use it. This is where the cavalry was useful, like in marshes. But most of the terrain is suited for tank divisions. Back to the email, he makes a few good points, but there was also a rather bad one, which I have to point out for several reasons. Yet academics ironically focus more on exotic weapons like Panthers and Messerschmitt jets than what was an essential arm of combat for armies back then. First off, academics, even if one defines the term rather loosely, generally don't focus on any of these weapon systems. I don't know of any academic work that focuses on these weapon systems. There are some related works like that from Schabel that look at the whole development process and the various myths, but works like his particularly point out that it was an exotic weapon. There are definitely a lot of works that deal with the Panther or Messerschmitt 262, yet they are generally not by academics and many are often rather lacking. Major exceptions are the works by Jens and Doyle, or when it comes to the Panther specifically, the work by Marco Köhler. About academics, generally most people don't know what they do. And keep in mind nowadays, there's no necessity to speak badly about academics, since they are far better at ruining their reputations themselves. Second, while the Messerschmitt 262 can be seen as an exotic weapon with only about 1,400 produced compared to the Messerschmitt 109 with about 34,000 produced, the Panther clearly was not. Almost 6,000 Panthers were produced, yet the Germans produced a bit less than 30,000 tanks from 1934 to 1945, excluding Sturmgeschütze, self-propelled guns and Jagdpanzer, but including the Panther. So about 20% of all German tanks with turrets produced were Panthers. This is far from exotic. Now, if you take the Tiger instead of the Panther, this certainly would be more fitting as an exotic weapon. Third, the Messerschmitt 262, as exotic as it might seem, is still rather relevant due to the fact that it was the first operational jet fighter that saw combat action, and after World War II, jet fighters became the mainstay. Meanwhile, the Third Army disbanded their cavalry forces in 1955, and it was rather late in that regard as well. Fourth, in terms of industrial production, research, development, and various other topics, both the Messerschmitt 262 and the Panther were far more relevant in terms of future application and relevancy than the cavalry. Fifth, cavalry units are very manpower intensive and low tech. This was not really an option for a Western force post-World War II. They went mostly mechanized and high tech. To give you just one number, the German Bundeswehr during the Cold War had at its peak a mere 14 divisions. Keep in mind, in 1939 the Wehrmacht had about 100 divisions, which increased significantly over the course of the war. To conclude, do I think that cavalry is neglected or underrepresented in research? I would say no, particularly in regard to the vast amount of other elements that clearly had more impact on the war yet are very underrepresented in research. In my opinion, two of the most under-researched areas in terms of importance are artillery and mines. And those two are still very relevant nowadays, particularly if you look at the war in Ukraine, where one could argue that they even dominate the battlefield, either actively or passively. But back to World War II. Let us look at the German side when it comes to mines and cavalry. There is at least one complete work on the German cavalry in modern warfare that covers 1870 to 1945. Meanwhile, I don't know of any book that covers German mine warfare in World War II. I also asked another researcher who knows way more about the German army in World War II than I do, and he also noted that he does not know any work. Additionally, I asked a German combat engineer that knows quite a lot about military history as well. He also doesn't know any works covering that topic. Of course, you might argue mines are not important. Well, I disagree. Since the survey of Allied tank casualties in World War II from 1951 noted that the second highest cause after gunfire for Allied tank casualty was mines. Gunfire accounted for 54%, whereas mines made up 20% of the tank losses. Thank you to the Panzermuseum Munster for inviting me, thank you for Andrew for reviewing the script, thank you for watching, and see you next time.